While Germany's troops on the Eastern Front subsisted on dwindling rations of black bread and ersatz coffee, thousands of their captured comrades dined on hearty American meals in the sweltering heat of Texas. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. As the Third Reich struggled to feed its massive war machine across Europe, the United States was housing, feeding, and employing over 50,000 German prisoners of war in the Lone Star State alone, men who often wrote home that they were eating better in captivity than they had in Hitler's army. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world, and if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The first German POWs arrived on American soil in April 1942, bewildered men from Rommel's Afrika Korps who had been captured in the North African campaign. They stepped off trains into the glaring Texas sun, squinting at landscapes that seemed alien compared to their European homeland. Flat, endless plains, scorching heat, and unfamiliar vegetation. What they couldn't have known was that they were about to become participants in one of the most unusual chapters of World War II, a massive prisoner management program that would ultimately house over 425,000 Axis POWs nationwide, with Texas becoming the epicenter of this enormous undertaking. Texas was an ideal location for these camps. Its vast, undeveloped spaces provided ample room for secure facilities far from population centers. The warm climate meant minimal heating costs and allowed for year-round agricultural work. And perhaps most importantly, Texas had a desperate need for labor. As millions of American men shipped overseas to fight, the state's farms, factories, and businesses faced crippling workforce shortages. German POWs would soon fill that gap, becoming an integral part of the Texas wartime economy. The Geneva Convention of 1929 provided strict guidelines for the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States, eager to ensure proper treatment of American POWs in enemy hands, followed these rules meticulously. Prisoners were to receive the same quality and quantity of food as American troops in basic training, adequate housing, medical care, and payment for work. They could not be forced to work in areas directly supporting the war effort. Unlike the brutal conditions in Japanese camps or the deliberate starvation in German camps on the Eastern Front, America's POW program would become a study in humanitarian treatment, pragmatic, orderly, and surprisingly generous. Camp Hearn, established in 1942 near the small agricultural town of Hearn in Robertson County, was one of the first and largest Texas POW camps. Designed to hold 4,800 prisoners, it featured barracks arranged in compounds, surrounded by guard towers and barbed wire fences. Other major facilities would follow: Camp Swift near Bastrop, Camp Hood, now Fort Hood, near Killeen, Camp Bowie in Brownwood, and dozens of smaller satellite camps scattered across the state. By 1943, Texas hosted nearly half of all German POWs in America. For Texans, the arrival of thousands of enemy soldiers was initially met with apprehension. Local newspapers ran sensationalist headlines about Nazis in Texas, and rumors spread about escape attempts and sabotage. Cheryl Miller, whose grandfather owned farmland near Camp Swift, recalled the community reaction. People were scared at first. These were the enemy, after all. My grandmother wouldn't let us children walk to school alone for months after the camp opened. But then, as time went on, people got used to seeing the German boys working in the fields. They were just young men, far from home. The first prisoners to arrive were primarily from the Afrika Korps, professional soldiers who had served under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. They were disciplined, well-trained, and often surprised by their treatment. Karl Brenner, captured near Tunis in 1943, wrote in his diary, "We expected harsh conditions, perhaps even mistreatment. What we found was beyond imagination: clean barracks, plentiful food, even sporting facilities." After months of desert warfare on reduced rations, it seems we have found paradise in Texas, of all places. The daily routine in these camps was structured, but not overly harsh. Reveille sounded at 5:30 a.m., followed by roll call, breakfast, and work assignments. Prisoners who volunteered for labor, and most did to escape boredom and earn scrip for the camp canteen, were transported to local farms, canneries, or other workplaces. They returned to camp for dinner, after which they had free time until lights out at 10 p.m. Sundays were generally free, with religious services available for those who wished to attend. What astonished many prisoners was the food. In accordance with the Geneva Convention, they received the same rations as American garrison troops, plentiful portions of meat, vegetables, bread, and even desserts. For men who had endured the increasingly meager rations of the German military, especially those who had served on the Eastern Front, the abundance was almost incomprehensible. Fritz Engelmann, a former lieutenant captured in Sicily, remarked in a letter home, "We eat better here than I ever did as an officer in the Wehrmacht. Yesterday we had roast beef, potatoes, green beans, white bread, and apple pie. The Americans waste more food than we saw in a week in Russia." This abundance stood in stark contrast to the situation in Germany, where food rationing had grown increasingly severe as the war progressed. By 1943, German civilians were limited to weekly rations of 2,000 grams of bread, 250 grams of meat, 150 grams of fats, and 100 grams of sugar. German soldiers on the front lines received priority for supplies, but even they faced shortages as Allied bombing disrupted transportation networks, and the Eastern Front consumed massive resources. The War Department's policy of strict adherence to the Geneva Convention wasn't purely altruistic, it was strategic. By treating German POWs well, America hoped to ensure better treatment for its own men in enemy hands and to create goodwill that might be useful in post-war reconstruction. This policy sometimes led to ironic situations that troubled Americans on the home front, who were themselves subject to rationing. There were occasional newspaper stories and congressional inquiries about coddled Nazis eating butter and steaks, while American families made do with ration coupons. The reality was more nuanced. Most camps maintained discipline and provided humane but not luxurious conditions. However, the American approach to prisoner management did differ significantly from the German and Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners. The death rate for American POWs in German hands was about 1.2%, while in Japanese camps it reached a staggering 37%. In contrast, the death rate for German POWs in American custody was just 0.15%, most from illnesses or accidents. Beyond physical conditions, the camps developed complex social structures. The U.S. military initially made the mistake of allowing prisoners to organize themselves, which often led to hardcore Nazi elements taking control. They instituted their own internal discipline, sometimes terrorizing prisoners who were not sufficiently loyal to Hitler. Anton Brunn, a prisoner at Camp Herne, later described the dynamic. There were the true believers, the Nazi fanatics, who thought the war could still be won. They watched everything, reported any disloyal comments. Then there were those of us who knew Germany was finished but had to pretend otherwise to avoid trouble. The Americans didn't understand at first how this worked among us. By 1944, the American authorities had learned to separate the most ardent Nazis from other prisoners. They created special camps for hardcore Nazi supporters and separate facilities for anti-Nazis, particularly those who were Jewish or had opposed Hitler before being conscripted. The majority of moderate prisoners remained in the regular camp system, including those in Texas. Work became the centerpiece of the POW experience in Texas. The state's agricultural sector was desperate for labor, and German prisoners proved to be excellent workers. They picked cotton, harvested rice and citrus fruits, cut lumber, and worked in food processing plants. They were paid 80 cents per day in canteen credit, not cash, which they could use to purchase toiletries, snacks, beer, limited to 2 bottles per day, and other small luxuries. 10 cents from their daily wage was set aside in a savings account to be given to them upon repatriation. Farmers quickly came to appreciate the German workers. Unlike some other POWs, particularly Italians who were also held in Texas in smaller numbers, the Germans had a reputation for efficiency and thoroughness. John McIntyre, who used POW labor on his cotton farm near Huntsville, recalled, "Those boys knew how to work. They'd meet their quotas by midday and ask for more. They had this methodical way of doing things. The Italian prisoners would sing and take breaks in the shade, but the Germans just kept going. Must be something in their nature." The work program had another unexpected effect. It humanized the enemy. As Texans worked alongside German POWs day after day, the demonized Hun of propaganda posters became Hans or Fritz, a young man who showed pictures of his family back home and shared a cigarette during breaks. Relationships, while officially discouraged, inevitably formed. There were even a few romances between POWs and local women, though these were rare and severely punished when discovered. Cultural exchange flourished in unexpected ways. Many Germans spoke some English or learned quickly, and they were often better educated than their rural Texas guards. They introduced soccer to areas where it had never been played, taught European carpentry techniques, and shared their music and art. The camps became centers of cultural production, with prisoners creating theatrical performances, orchestras, and art studios. At Camp Hearn, prisoners built a large outdoor theater where they performed classical German plays and orchestra concerts, sometimes attended by locals from town. The prisoners were also allowed to further their education. They organized classes taught by fellow prisoners who had been teachers, engineers, or other professionals in civilian life. Some camps arranged for correspondence courses through Swiss agencies as allowed by the Geneva Convention. Libraries were stocked with approved books, and prisoners published their own newspapers and magazines, though these were censored by American authorities. Religion played a significant role in camp life. Most German prisoners were either Lutheran or Catholic, and the Army provided chaplains for both faiths. Religious services were well attended, offering spiritual comfort and a sense of normalcy. For Christmas 1944, Camp Hearn's prisoners created an elaborate nativity scene and held services that some American guards joined. These shared religious observances further blurred the lines between captors and captives. Not all aspects of camp life were positive. The summer Texas heat was oppressive for men accustomed to European climates. Dieter Thalmann, held at Camp Bowie, wrote, "The heat is unbearable, like nothing I have experienced. Men faint in the fields even with our straw hats and water breaks. At night, the barracks are like ovens, and we lie sweating on our bunks, unable to sleep. I now understand why Texans move so slowly. It is the only way to survive in this inferno." Escapes were attempted, though they were usually brief and unsuccessful. The vastness of Texas worked against escapees. Where would they go in a land where they clearly looked and sounded foreign? Most were recaptured within days, sometimes after being reported by civilians. The consequences were typically 30 days of solitary confinement on bread and water. A few escapes became local legends, like the POW from Camp Hearn, who made it all the way to the Mexican border before being caught, or the 2 men from Camp Swift who lived in the woods for nearly a month, stealing food from farmhouses at night. As 1944 progressed, news from Europe had a profound impact on camp morale. The D-Day invasion, the Allied advance through France, and the bombing of German cities led to increasing recognition among many prisoners that Germany would lose the war. For some, this led to depression or withdrawal. For others, particularly those who had never been committed Nazis, it brought a sense of relief that the end might be near. The U.S. government began a subtle re-education program showing carefully selected newsreels about the war and making American newspapers available. The goal was to prepare prisoners for a democratic post-Nazi Germany. These efforts met with mixed success, largely depending on the prisoners' pre-existing political beliefs. Some embraced the opportunity to learn about democracy, while hardcore Nazis organized resistance to what they saw as propaganda. In late 1944, a new type of prisoner began arriving in Texas camps, men captured after D-Day who had very different experiences from the earlier Afrika Korps veterans. These were often younger, more thoroughly indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, having grown up entirely under Hitler's regime. Many were Volkssturm, hastily trained militia, sometimes as young as 16 or as old as 60. There were also an increasing number of SS troops who were generally separated from regular Wehrmacht prisoners due to tensions between the groups. Wilhelm Seidlitz was one such late war prisoner captured in the Falaise Pocket in August 1944 and eventually transported to Camp Swift. At just 17, he had been drafted into the Wehrmacht in the war's final desperate months. I arrived believing everything our leaders had told us, that America was controlled by Jews, that we were still winning the war, that Hitler would unleash secret weapons to save Germany. Within 3 months at Camp Swift, talking with the older prisoners and seeing the news, I realized it had all been lies. My entire world collapsed. What had my friends died for? What purpose did any of it serve? The American authorities faced a challenge with these late war arrivals. They were often more resistant to authority and sometimes created tension with longer-term prisoners who had adapted to camp life. Special orientation programs were developed, and problem prisoners were transferred to more secure facilities outside of Texas. By early 1945, the camp system had adapted to these new dynamics, maintaining relatively smooth operations despite the influx. As the European war neared its end, a new challenge emerged. What would happen to these men after Germany surrendered? The Geneva Convention called for prompt repatriation after hostilities ceased, but the reality of occupied, divided Germany complicated matters. Some prisoners expressed fear about returning to areas occupied by Soviet forces. Others worried about the devastation they would find at home, based on letters from family describing bombed cities and food shortages. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 didn't immediately change conditions in the Texas camps, but it did transform the prisoners' legal status and outlook. Work programs continued as the labor was still badly needed for the American economy. However, security was gradually reduced and greater privileges were granted. The focus shifted toward preparation for eventual repatriation, with increased emphasis on democratic re-education and vocational training that might be useful in rebuilding Germany. For Hans Miller, captured in Tunisia and held at Camp Herne for over 3 years, the end of the war brought complicated emotions. We had known for months that Germany would lose, but when it actually happened, it still came as a shock. Some men wept openly. Others celebrated quietly, especially those who had opposed Hitler. I felt mostly relief that the killing had stopped, but also great worry for my family in Dresden. We had heard about the bombing, but I had no way of knowing if they had survived. This uncertainty was its own kind of prison. As summer turned to fall in 1945, the process of repatriation began, but it would proceed slowly with priority given to those captured earliest. The POWs would be among the last Germans to return home, long after combat veterans from the American, British, and French armies had been demobilized. Many wouldn't see Germany again until 1946, or even 1947, as they were needed to help with post-war agricultural work and reconstruction projects in both America and Europe. During this limbo period between war and peace, relationships between prisoners and Texans often deepened. With security restrictions eased, more interaction was permitted. Some farmers made arrangements to continue employing particular prisoners they had come to rely on. Community events sometimes included POWs, particularly those with musical talents. A few prisoners even received marriage proposals from local women, though these could not be acted upon until after repatriation. As 1945 drew to a close, the Texas POW system was beginning to contract. Some smaller branch camps were closed, with prisoners consolidated into the larger facilities. Camp Herne, once home to nearly 5,000 men, saw its population drop below $3,000 by December. The prisoners who remained continued their work, but with a different perspective. They were no longer enemies, but men caught between two worlds, waiting to return to a homeland many barely recognized from letters and news reports. What none of them yet realized was that some would be offered the chance to remain in or return to the United States after repatriation, particularly those with valuable skills or those who had family connections in America. Others would carry their Texas experiences back to Germany, where they would help rebuild their shattered country, using lessons learned during their time as prisoners. The story of the German POWs in Texas represents one of the most successful yet often overlooked aspects of America's World War II effort. Through a combination of pragmatism, adherence to international law, and basic humanity, the United States turned enemy captives into productive workers and, in many cases, into men with a newfound appreciation for democratic values. While Nazi Germany's treatment of prisoners on the Eastern Front was characterized by deliberate cruelty and starvation, and Japan's POW camps became infamous for their brutality, America's approach demonstrated that even in total war, humanity could be maintained. For the communities that hosted these camps, the experience left lasting impressions. Relationships formed, perspectives changed, and the feared enemy became recognizable as human. The physical remnants of the camps largely disappeared in the decades following the war. Barracks were dismantled, the land returned to agricultural use or redeveloped. But the memories remained, passed down through generations of Texans who found themselves unwitting participants in this unique historical intersection. As the first groups of POWs prepared for repatriation in late 1945, they faced a journey into uncertainty. Germany lay in ruins, divided among the victorious Allies. Many of their hometowns had been devastated by bombing, political systems were being transformed, and denazification programs were underway. They would return not as defeated warriors, but as potential rebuilders of a new Germany, carrying with them experiences and perspectives gained in the unlikeliest of places, the prisoner of war camps of Texas. Ernst Kramer, scheduled for repatriation in December 1945, reflected on his mixed emotions as he packed his few belongings at Camp Swift. "I have been an enemy soldier, a prisoner, and now I do not know what I will be. Germany as I knew it no longer exists. My hometown is in the Russian zone. My family, if they live, face hunger and cold this winter. Yet here I am, well-fed, unharmed, having spent my war in safety, while others fought and died. I am grateful for the humane treatment we received, but I carry a burden of guilt for having had it easier than those who remained in the fight, and certainly easier than civilians at home. How will they receive us, we who return healthy and well-fed from America?" What Kramer and his fellow prisoners couldn't know was that the world was about to change again. As they prepared to return to a defeated Germany, new tensions were already emerging between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was beginning, and it would reshape the futures of both Germany and the United States. The knowledge, connections, and perspectives gained by these prisoners in Texas would play an unexpected role in that new conflict as former enemies became allies against a new totalitarian threat. The Cold War's emergence would transform the significance of the German POW experience in America. As tensions between the United States and Soviet Union intensified through 1946, American authorities began to view returned POWs as potential assets in the ideological struggle for Germany's future. Men who had experienced American democracy firsthand might serve as ambassadors of Western values in their home communities, particularly those returning to the Soviet occupation zone. For the prisoners still awaiting repatriation in early 1946, the changing international situation created new uncertainties. Repatriation schedules were repeatedly delayed, partly due to transportation limitations, but also because of the continuing need for their labor. The last harvest season of 1945 had seen German POWs picking cotton across Texas while negotiations continued about their return. Some began to wonder if they would ever go home. The process of returning POWs to Europe involved complex logistics. Prisoners were transported by train to East Coast ports, then loaded onto Liberty ships converted for passenger service. The ships were often the same vessels that had brought American troops home, now making return voyages with human cargo of a different kind. Most prisoners landed in France or Britain, then traveled by train to Germany, where they were processed through reception centers run by the occupying powers. Walter Strauss, who spent 3 years at Camp Hearn, described his journey home in a memoir written decades later. "We departed Galveston on a bright February morning in 1946. The ship was crowded, nearly 3,000 of us packed into converted cargo holds. Many men were seasick, but I stood on deck whenever possible, watching America recede and wondering what lay ahead." After 2 weeks at sea, we docked at Le Havre, France. The contrast was immediate and shocking. Europe was gray, damaged, hungry. People in ragged clothes watched us disembark with expressions I couldn't read. Were they hateful, envious, or merely curious about these German men returning healthy from America while they had suffered occupation? The reception many POWs received upon returning to Germany was often difficult. In a country struggling with severe food shortages, housing crises, and the psychological trauma of defeat, the well-fed, well-dressed returnees from America sometimes faced resentment. Others encountered suspicion about their political reliability, especially from Soviet occupation authorities who viewed time in American captivity as potential indoctrination in capitalist values. Friedrich Bergmann, repatriated to his hometown near Leipzig in the Soviet zone, later wrote, "My own mother didn't recognize me at first. She had expected a half-starved wreck, but I was healthy, even carrying extra weight. While neighbors whose sons had fought on the Eastern Front received broken men or death notices, I returned looking as though I'd been on holiday. Some called us Ami Liebchen, American sweethearts. Others simply turned away. The Russians questioned me repeatedly about what the Americans had taught us, convinced we had been trained as spies. For those returning to the American, British, or French zones, the reception was generally better. Their experiences in Texas often gave them advantages in finding work with occupation authorities, as they spoke some English and understood American customs. Some even received letters of recommendation from former employers in Texas, which proved valuable in securing positions with the occupation government. The majority of Texas POWs completed repatriation by the end of 1946, though a small number remained in American custody into 1947, working on reconstruction projects in France and Germany before final release. A significant minority never returned to permanent residence in Germany at all. Approximately 5,000 German POWs who had been held in the United States, many of them from Texas camps, eventually emigrated to the U.S. or Canada after being repatriated. One such case was Kurt Wagner, who had worked on the King Ranch while imprisoned at a branch camp near Kingsville. After repatriation to Bavaria in 1946, he found his family's property had been requisitioned for housing displaced persons. Unable to reclaim his pre-war life and impressed by his treatment in America, he applied for immigration as soon as restrictions on former enemy soldiers were lifted in 1948. By 1950, he was back in Texas, working as a foreman on a cattle ranch near San Antonio. "America gave me something Germany never could, a fresh start without the weight of the past," Wagner told the San Antonio Express in a 1955 interview. "In Germany, I would always be a former Wehrmacht soldier, judged for a cause I never fully believed in. Here in Texas, I'm judged by my work ethic and character. The men I once faced as a prisoner are now my neighbors and friends. There is a greatness in that transformation that still amazes me." The vast majority who did return to Germany permanently became part of the economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, of post-war West Germany. Many credited their American experience with giving them valuable skills and perspectives that helped them succeed in the new democratic society. A survey conducted by German academics in the 1960s found that former POWs from American camps had higher rates of business ownership, higher average incomes, and more positive views of democracy than comparable Germans who had been prisoners of other Allied powers or who had not been POWs. Horst Steinmeier, who had picked cotton near Lübeck as a POW before returning to Stuttgart, became a successful manufacturing executive. In a 1970 interview, he reflected, "The Americans taught us to think like Americans, practical, optimistic, always looking for better methods." In the POW camp, I learned about quality control, production efficiency, and labor management. These were not military secrets, just everyday American business practices, but they were revolutionary to us. I brought this thinking back to Germany when I started my company. For the communities that had hosted the POW camps, the departure of the prisoners left mixed legacies. The economic boost provided by their labor ended, creating renewed workforce challenges until returning American veterans filled the gap. The personal relationships formed, sometimes cordial, occasionally hostile, rarely romantic, lingered in memory, gradually transforming into local legend and lore. Some Texas communities maintained connections with their former prisoners long after the war. The town of Hearne, which had initially regarded its 5,000 German prisoners with suspicion, later developed a historical preservation effort centered on Camp Hearne. In the 1990s, former prisoners were invited back for reunions, where they toured the few remaining camp structures and met with local residents who remembered them. Edwin Schneider, who returned to Hearne in 1995 after 5 decades in Germany, found himself treated as an honored guest rather than a former enemy. "The mayor gave me a key to the city," he marveled. 50 years ago, I was behind barbed wire here. Now they ask me to share my stories with school children. History takes strange turns." The physical traces of the Texas POW camps largely disappeared in the years following the war. The temporary structures were dismantled, the materials often repurposed for civilian construction during the post-war housing shortage. Camp Hearne's lands were returned to agricultural use. Camp Swift was partially incorporated into expanded military training grounds and partially returned to private ownership. At Camp Bowie, only a small museum exhibit commemorates the thousands of German prisoners once held there. Yet, in archives, personal collections, and memories, artifacts of this history survived. Letters written by prisoners to family in Germany, often heavily censored, but filled with descriptions of Texas life. Crafts created in camp workshops, intricate wooden boxes, woven baskets, paintings of Texas landscapes, photographs showing prisoners and guards in unexpected moments of camaraderie, work logs documenting the millions of man-hours of labor that helped sustain the Texas agricultural economy during the war years. Perhaps most remarkable are the architectural and artistic remnants created by the prisoners. At Camp Hearne, POWs constructed fountains, stone walkways, and elaborate gardens to make their surroundings more bearable. They painted murals on barracks walls, created a theater with proper stage lighting, and built a complex miniature German village complete with functioning water wheels. Most of these creations were destroyed when the camp closed, but archaeological excavations in the 1990s uncovered foundations, artifacts, and remnants of these structures. The most enduring legacies, however, were the invisible ones, the changed perspectives, shared experiences, and human connections formed across the divide of war. For a generation of Germans and Texans whose countries had been bitter enemies, these camps created spaces of unexpected interaction that complicated the simple narratives of wartime propaganda. They saw each other not as faceless enemies, but as individuals with shared hopes, fears, and humanity. Rudolf Meyer, who spent 2 years at Camp Swift, expressed this transformation in a letter to his former guard decades after the war. When I arrived in Texas, I saw Americans as my captors and enemies. When I left, I saw them as people not so different from myself. This change in perspective was perhaps the most valuable thing I gained from my time as a prisoner. It allowed me to embrace the new Germany's friendship with America without the bitterness that consumed some of my comrades who had not had this experience. This human dimension of the POW story extends beyond individual relationships to broader questions about how nations treat their enemies during war and how these choices influence post-war reconciliation. The humane treatment of German POWs in accordance with the Geneva Convention stood in stark contrast to the brutality exhibited by Nazi Germany towards Soviet prisoners, millions of whom died from deliberate starvation, exposure, and mistreatment. It also contrasted with American treatment of Japanese prisoners and Japanese-American internees, highlighting the racial dimensions of wartime policies. While German POWs in Texas worked freely in communities, ate in local restaurants, and sometimes attended public events, Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, were confined to remote internment camps, their property confiscated, and their loyalty questioned despite no evidence of wrongdoing. This disparity reflected the racial attitudes of 1940s America, where Germans, despite being enemies, were seen as culturally and racially similar to white Americans. Many Texans had German ancestry themselves, with communities like Fredericksburg and New Braunfels founded by German immigrants in the 19th century. This perceived kinship made it easier to view German prisoners as temporary enemies rather than permanent threats. The treatment of POWs also served strategic goals beyond the war itself. As early as 1944, American officials recognized that Germany would need to be rebuilt and reintegrated into the community of nations after Hitler's defeat. The respectful treatment of prisoners, combined with exposure to American democracy and prosperity, was seen as an investment in future relations, a calculation that proved prescient as West Germany became a crucial Cold War ally. Colonel James Garrison, who commanded Camp Hearn from 1943 to 1945, articulated this vision in a speech to the Hearn Chamber of Commerce shortly before the camp's closure. "The men we have held here will return to Germany as witnesses to American values. They have seen how a democratic society functions, how prosperity and freedom go hand in hand. Some will reject these lessons, clinging to the toxic ideologies that led Germany to ruin. But many will carry this experience home and become partners in building a new Germany that can stand with America rather than against it." Garrison's prediction proved largely accurate. In the critical early years of the Cold War, as the division between East and West Germany hardened, former POWs often emerged as supporters of democratic institutions and alignment with the United States. Their first-hand knowledge of America countered Soviet propaganda and helped anchor West Germany firmly in the Western Alliance. Werner Baumeister, who spent 1943 to 1946 at camps in Texas and Oklahoma before returning to his home near Frankfurt, became active in local politics with the Christian Democratic Union, the center-right party led by Konrad Adenauer that guided West Germany's integration with the West. "My time in America showed me that there is a form of capitalism with a human face," he later wrote in his memoirs. "The Americans weren't perfect, but they treated us, their enemies, with more humanity than the Nazi regime treated its own citizens who dared to dissent. This lesson shaped my political beliefs for a lifetime." For those who returned to areas under Soviet control, the experience often led to difficult choices. Some concealed their time in America to avoid suspicion from communist authorities. Others used their American connections to arrange escapes to the West. A few were recruited by American intelligence agencies to provide information about conditions in East Germany using the relationships and trust established during their time as POWs in Texas. The economic impact of the POW labor program was substantial. At its peak in 1944-45, German prisoners in Texas provided millions of hours of agricultural labor, harvesting crops that might otherwise have rotted in the fields. They processed food, cut timber, built infrastructure, and maintained railroad tracks. Their work helped prevent a collapse of the Texas agricultural sector when labor shortages were most acute, stabilizing food supplies for both domestic consumption and overseas shipments to allies and liberated territories. This economic contribution came at minimal cost to American taxpayers. The POW labor program was largely self-financing, with employers paying prevailing wages to the War Department for prisoner labor. After deducting the costs of housing, feeding, and guarding the prisoners, the program actually generated a surplus of approximately $100 million, equivalent to over $1.5 billion in 2025 dollars. Funds that were used to cover the costs of American POWs held overseas and to support the overall war effort. For the prisoners themselves, the economic aspects of their captivity were complex. While they received only a small portion of the wages paid for their labor, they accumulated savings for their eventual return to Germany. More significantly, they gained practical work experience in modern agricultural and industrial methods that would prove valuable in post-war Germany. They also enjoyed a standard of living that, paradoxically, exceeded what many had experienced as free men in wartime Germany and what most would experience in the immediate post-war years. The educational and cultural programs in the camps also had lasting impacts. Many prisoners used their time to learn English, study trades, or continue interrupted university education through correspondence courses. Camp libraries, stocked with carefully screened books, introduced them to American literature and history. Film screenings, while initially viewed skeptically as propaganda, exposed them to American culture and values. Heinrich Müller, a former university student when drafted into the Wehrmacht, continued his studies while at Camp Swift. "I arrived barely speaking English and left nearly fluent," he recalled. "I read Hemingway, Faulkner, and Steinbeck in the original. I took mathematics courses through a Swiss academic program. In some ways, I received a better education as a prisoner than I might have as a free man during those war years." The artistic and musical life in the camps was remarkably rich. Professional musicians among the prisoners formed orchestras that performed classical German works alongside American music. Artists created paintings, sculptures, and handicrafts, some of which were sold to Americans through camp exchanges. Theatrical productions ranged from Schiller and Goethe to comedies and variety shows that provided rare moments of levity. At Camp Hearn, prisoner Alfred Schlitter directed a production of Schiller's William Tell, a play about resistance to tyranny that took on complex meanings in the context of Nazi Germany's collapse. The performance was attended by American officers and local dignitaries, receiving positive reviews in the camp newspaper and even a mention in the Hearn Democrat. This cultural exchange represented a form of soft diplomacy that humanized the prisoners in the eyes of their captors. Religious life provided another dimension of normality and solace. Most camps had both Protestant and Catholic chaplains, and religious services were well attended. For many prisoners, faith offered a framework for understanding their circumstances and maintaining hope for the future. Christmas celebrations were particularly significant, combining religious observance with memories of home and traditions that transcended the conflict. Pastor Wilhelm Hoffman, a Lutheran minister who served as a chaplain at Camp Bowie, described the Christmas Eve service in 1944. "The chapel was filled beyond capacity. We sang the old carols, Stille Nacht, O Tannenbaum, and for those hours the men were transported home. Some American guards stood at the back listening. When we sang Silent Night in both languages together, I saw tears on many faces, German and American alike. In that moment, the war seemed very far away." As Germany's military situation deteriorated through 1944 and early 1945, the mood in the camps fluctuated between denial, anger, and resignation. News of Allied bombing raids on German cities caused great anxiety among prisoners worried about their families. Letters from home, heavily censored and often months old by the time they arrived, brought news of destruction, displacement, and civilian hardship that contrasted sharply with the prisoners' relatively comfortable circumstances. This created a psychological burden that many prisoners struggled to process. They were safe and well-fed while their countrymen suffered, creating what some described as survivor's guilt decades before that term entered common usage. Others rationalized their situation as the fortune of war or focused on how they could use their American experience to help rebuild Germany after the inevitable defeat. Major Hans Alberti, a career officer captured in North Africa who became a camp spokesman at Camp Swift, addressed this dilemma in a speech to fellow prisoners after news of Dresden's destruction reached them. "We cannot change what is happening to our homeland. We cannot fight from here. What we can do is prepare ourselves to be useful when we return. Germany will need men who have seen another way of life, who have learned skills, who understand our former enemies. This is now our duty, not to win a war already lost, but to help win the peace that must follow." The American authorities' approach to managing the prisoners evolved significantly over the course of the war. Initial policies focused primarily on security and compliance with the Geneva Convention. By 1944, a more sophisticated approach emerged that included careful classification of prisoners based on their political beliefs, selective re-education efforts, and greater integration of work programs with local communities. The Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office developed a re-education program called the Intellectual Diversion Program, later renamed the Intellectual Reorientation Program. Initially disguised as entertainment and education to comply with Geneva Convention restrictions on propaganda, it gradually became more explicit in its democratic messaging as Germany's defeat became certain. Selected prisoners attended courses on American history, democratic institutions, and civic values. They watched documentaries about American life and carefully chosen newsreels about the war. A special newspaper, Der Ruf, The Call, was created for distribution in the camps, featuring articles by anti-Nazi German prisoners that subtly promoted democratic ideas while reporting war news with more objectivity than official German sources had provided. These efforts met with mixed success. Hardcore Nazis rejected them as propaganda, while those already skeptical of Hitler's regime were more receptive. The middle group, ordinary soldiers with no strong political convictions, often remained cautious, unwilling to embrace American ideas fully, while Germany's future remained uncertain. Yet seeds were planted that would germinate in the post-war years. Friedrich Kellner, who taught in the re-education program at Camp Herne after being identified as anti-Nazi, observed, "We could not create Democrats overnight. What we could do was create doubt about what many had been taught their entire lives. Questions are the beginning of wisdom. If we made them question the Nazi worldview, we succeeded, even if they did not immediately embrace alternatives." As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the POW camps entered a new phase. Security restrictions were gradually relaxed. The work program expanded, with prisoners taking on more varied assignments as labor shortages persisted. The Intellectual Reorientation Program became more explicit, now openly preparing prisoners for life in a democratic post-Nazi Germany. The American military government in occupied Germany specifically requested that certain categories of prisoners receive priority for repatriation, those with skills needed for reconstruction, those with democratic leanings who might influence their communities, and those from areas suffering severe labor shortages. This pragmatic approach recognized that former POWs could serve as a stabilizing influence in chaotic post-war conditions. For many prisoners, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, which hastened Japan's surrender, raised troubling questions about the future. If such devastating weapons existed, what would the next war bring? This sober realization contributed to many former POWs becoming advocates for peace and European integration after their return to Germany. Herbert Schmidt, who witnessed the reaction at Camp Swift, wrote, "When news of the atomic bomb reached us, An eerie silence fell over the camp. Men who had been soldiers, who had seen combat, understood immediately what this meant for the future of warfare. One officer said, "Between this American bomb and Russian ambitions, Germany must never again be the battlefield of great powers. We have seen enough destruction for 10 lifetimes." As 1945 gave way to 1946, the repatriation process accelerated, though it remained frustratingly slow for many prisoners. Priority was generally given to those captured earliest, those with needed skills, and those with compelling compassionate circumstances, such as family hardships. The process was complicated by transportation limitations, screening procedures to identify war criminals, and continuing labor needs in America. By mid-1946, the Texas POW population had decreased significantly. Camp Hearn closed in January 1946, Camp Swift's POW section in February 1946, and most smaller branch camps were consolidated or shuttered. Only a few facilities remained operational into late 1946, primarily holding prisoners awaiting transportation or those with specialized skills still needed for specific projects. The departure of the prisoners marked the end of a unique chapter in Texas history, a time when enemy soldiers became part of the local economy and, in some cases, the community fabric. For many Texans who had worked alongside them, the experience challenged preconceptions and humanized the enemy. For the prisoners, Texas represented an unexpected detour in their military service that often changed their life trajectories. Johann Weber, who spent 3 years at camps in Texas and Oklahoma before returning to Bavaria, later reflected, "I came to America as a soldier of the Wehrmacht, expecting to be treated as an enemy. I left as a man who had seen another way of life, who had worked alongside Americans and come to respect them. This experience changed me more than combat ever did. War teaches hatred. What I learned in Texas taught understanding." As the Cold War intensified through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the importance of the POW experience took on new dimensions. West Germany, formally established in 1949, became a crucial ally in America's containment strategy against Soviet expansion. Former POWs, particularly those who had been in Texas and other American camps, often became advocates for this alliance, having seen firsthand that Americans were not the enemies portrayed by Nazi propaganda. When the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed in 1949, with West Germany joining in 1955, some German military officers who had been POWs in Texas returned to service in the new Democratic German Armed Forces. Their American experience proved valuable in building the military partnership that would help maintain peace in Europe for decades to come. Karl-Heinz Hoffmann, a former lieutenant who spent 1944-46 at Camp Bowie, rose to become a general in the Bundeswehr, West German Federal Defense Force. In his memoir, he credited his POW experience. "In Texas, I saw how an army could function in a democratic society, respecting civilian authority and individual rights, while maintaining discipline and effectiveness. This became my model when helping to build the new German military, an army of citizens, not automatons." On the economic front, former POWs participated enthusiastically in West Germany's economic miracle of the 1950s, often applying skills and work ethics developed during their time in Texas. The agricultural techniques they had learned while working on Texas farms proved adaptable to German conditions, helping increase food production during the critical recovery years. Werner Braun, who worked in food processing plants near San Antonio as a POW, established a similar operation in the Rhineland after his return. "The Americans taught us efficiency, quality control, and hygiene standards that were advanced for that time," he told an interviewer in 1960. When food was still scarce in Germany, these methods helped us maximize production from limited resources. My American experience became the foundation of my business success. The POW camps also left a legacy in unexpected areas like sports and culture. Soccer, already popular in Germany but little known in 1940s Texas, was introduced to several communities by prisoners who organized exhibition matches. Fredericksburg, with its German heritage, embraced the sport most enthusiastically, establishing youth programs that continued long after the POWs departed. Culinary influences, though subtle, also emerged. German POWs working in camp kitchens introduced traditional recipes that occasionally found their way into local cuisine, particularly in communities with existing German-American populations. Conversely, returning prisoners brought Texas influences back to Germany, a taste for beef barbecue, certain corn preparations, and even Tex-Mex flavors that were exotic in post-war Europe. The arts provided another avenue for lasting impact. Several prisoners who developed their artistic talents in camp workshops became professional artists after repatriation. Otto Winsen, who painted Texas landscapes while at Camp Swift, established a successful gallery in Munich featuring American scenes. "Texas taught me to see space differently," he commented in a 1970s exhibition catalog. The vastness, the quality of light, the relationship between land and sky. These elements transformed my artistic vision. For those former POWs who eventually returned to the United States as immigrants, their previous experience provided advantages in adaptation and integration. They knew the language, understood the culture, and often had contacts from their POW days who could help with employment and housing. Their unique status as former enemies turned neighbors generated occasional media interest, particularly during anniversary commemorations of World War II events. Heinrich Müller, who returned to Texas in 1957 after completing his education in Germany, became a professor at the University of Texas. In a 1995 interview marking the 50th anniversary of the war's end, he reflected on his journey. "I came to Texas as a prisoner in 1943, returned as an immigrant in 1957, and became a citizen in 1963. Each transition taught me something about America and about myself. The POW experience showed me that enemies need not remain enemies forever, that reconciliation is possible between people and between nations." As the decades passed and the World War II generation aged, interest in preserving the POW camp history grew. Historical societies in several Texas communities that had hosted camps began collecting artifacts, recording oral histories, and establishing small museums or exhibits. Academic researchers conducted interviews with former prisoners and guards, capturing memories before they were lost to time. Camp Hearn, which had housed over 5,000 German POWs at its peak, became the focus of an archaeological project in the 1990s. Excavations revealed foundations of prisoner-built fountains, gardens, and recreational facilities. These findings, combined with interviews and archival research, led to the establishment of a Camp Hearn historic site that now educates visitors about this little-known aspect of World War II home front history. Similar preservation efforts emerged at other former camp locations. At Camp Swift, now primarily a Texas National Guard training facility, a small museum includes exhibits on the POW operations. In Huntsville, where a branch camp was located, the Texas Prison Museum incorporates information about the nearby POW facility and how it differed from civilian prisons. These historical preservation efforts accelerated as the 50th anniversary of World War II generated renewed interest in all aspects of the conflict. Television documentaries, books, and academic studies explored the POW camp system, often highlighting the Texas camps due to their size and economic significance. Former prisoners, still able to travel, were sometimes invited back for commemorative events, creating emotional reunions with local residents who remembered them. Hans Gotter, who returned to Hearn for a 1995 commemoration, found himself treated as an honored guest in the town where he had once been confined behind barbed wire. "The mayor presented me with a key to the city," he marveled. "Children asked for my autograph as if I were a celebrity. How strange is history, that I am welcomed now where once I was an enemy. For the communities that had hosted these camps, the commemorations offered an opportunity to reckon with a complex legacy. While the economic benefits had been substantial, the moral questions about employing enemy prisoners while local men fought overseas had never been fully resolved. The events allowed for a more nuanced understanding of this history, acknowledging both pragmatic necessity and humanitarian values. As the 21st century dawned, the direct participants in this history were rapidly disappearing. The youngest POWs, those captured late in the war, were in their late 80s by 2025. Their memories, preserved in oral histories, memoirs, and academic studies, became part of the historical record, a reminder of how enemies can become allies, how war can give way to reconciliation, and how individual human connections can transcend national conflicts. The Texas POW camp story also offers lessons for contemporary conflicts. It demonstrates how adherence to international humanitarian standards, even during total war, can lay groundwork for post-war reconciliation. It shows how respectful treatment of enemy combatants can serve strategic interests by influencing their post-war attitudes. And it highlights how pragmatic solutions to wartime problems, like labor shortages, can be implemented while maintaining human dignity. For modern Germany and the United States, the POW experience represents one thread in the complex tapestry of their relationship, a relationship that evolved from bitter enmity in 2 world wars to one of the strongest international partnerships of the modern era. The men who once wore Wehrmacht uniforms while picking Texas cotton played a small but meaningful role in that transformation. In the words of historian Arnold Kramer, who conducted extensive research on the Texas POW camps, what began as a pragmatic solution to the problem of housing captured enemy soldiers became, inadvertently, one of America's most successful diplomatic initiatives. By treating German POWs with humanity and exposing them to American life, the United States created thousands of informal ambassadors who returned to Germany with first-hand knowledge that countered both Nazi propaganda and later Soviet narratives. As the last witnesses to this history pass from the scene, their stories remain as testament to how nations can move from conflict to cooperation, how individual human connections can transcend political divisions, and how even in war's darkest hours, glimpses of shared humanity can point the way toward a more peaceful future.